In a world that, well, rightly celebrates diversity, tolerance, pluralism, we often assume more options are always better.
Hmm.
But what happens when you hit a realm where multiple paths claim to lead to one single objective truth? Is there any space where that acceptance of pluralism just has to fail?
That is really the core, maybe even explosive question tackled by the philosopher Mortimer J. Adler in his very sharp work, Truth and Religion, the Plurality of Religions and the Unity of Truth.
Adler, right, the famous philosopher educator, the force behind the great books
The
movement.
very one.
The guy who pushed us to read deeply, critically, across all the big ideas, and he's asking us to face something pretty difficult here.
He is. And his thesis, it's really designed to make you think. Adler argues that pluralism, this idea that many things can be true together, is fine, even good, in areas like aesthetics or art, maybe even politics.
Like, you prefer modern art, I like classical, no problem there.
Exactly. That's
Okay.
fine. But, he says, when we get to truth claims about reality itself, especially religious ones that make factual claims about, say, God or the universe or salvation, he insists there must be a logical unity of truth.
So he's taking that fundamental rule of logic, a non-contradiction,
Right.
and basically saying it applies everywhere, globally. That contradictory claims just can't both be true.
That's precisely it. If one religion says salvation needs X and another says it needs non-X, Adler argues quite rigorously that they can't both be factually correct.
Okay, that definitely sets us up for a serious intellectual challenge, and it means we need a solid approach to examine it.
Mhm.
We believe that some books must be challenged. So this critique uses, where it fits, a step-by-step critical thinking framework mapping claims to evidence. We also bring in an intellectual framework for Mortimer J. Adler himself.
And we use the Golden Rule and the U.S. Preamble to look for ethical asymmetries. And then we wrap up with a logical analysis and aim for a balanced conclusion.
Right. And for you listening, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. This is powered by Google's NotebookLM, designed for a deeper, more dynamic book critique.
So let's dive in.
Let's start with his bedrock argument, that sharp difference between matters of taste and matters of fact. That really seems to power everything else.
It's absolutely central. He's saying pluralism is okay only where unity isn't logically required. So think about it like this. Saying chocolate's better than vanilla, that's taste.
Right. No objective truth there.
No inherent contradiction if we disagree. But claiming the Earth orbits the Sun, while someone else claims the Sun orbits the Earth, well, those clash. They're contradictory statements about objective fact.
Okay.
And Adler, citing thinkers like Aristotle and Aquinas, believes knowledge has to form a coherent whole. No contradictions allowed, like one big puzzle where all the pieces have to fit.
So if a statement is factually true, meaning it matches external reality, then anything denying it must be false. That's the correspondence theory of truth, isn't it? Applied even to theology.
Exactly right. The correspondence theory just asks, does the statement match reality?
Yeah.
But Adler adds this crucial nuance, which keeps him from being, well, overly simplistic. It's his distinction between poetic truth and logical truth.
Okay, let's unpack that because that seems key to how he allows for some pluralism.
Right. So poetic truth or narrative truth, that's where pluralism is totally fine. This covers art, metaphor, stories, subjective feelings.
So the emotional truth in a poem or music.
Exactly. That can be valid for you, and something totally different, even contradictory, can be valid for me. That realm handles contradiction just fine.
But the logical truth realm, that's different.
Completely different. Logical truth covers factual claims about objective reality,
Yeah.
whether it's science, history, or, importantly for this book, religion.
Uh-huh.
If a religion makes a specific factual claim about God's nature, say, or what happens after death, Adler says that claim is subject to reason, to the correspondence theory. Even deeply held faith assertions aren't immune if they claim to describe reality.
And this is where it gets quite interesting because he's not just aiming this at competing faith systems. He also criticizes, well, a kind of scientific dogmatism. He tries to be impartial.
That's a really important point. Adler warns against that sort of dogmatic, materialist view, you sometimes see it in scientific circles, that just dismisses anything non-material. Belief in angels, a soul, God, dismissing it without solid logical grounds.
So he's critiquing the easy dismissal of religion as just myth.
Yes, without grappling with its attempts to make real substantive claims. He's arguing against what some call Everoism, or these dual truth ideas where you try to keep faith and reason in totally separate boxes, never letting them interact.
Okay, so understanding his commitment to this unified truth. Let's turn the lens back on his own method. How does his book stack up when we analyze it using his own framework? His ideas about opinion, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom.
Right, applying the Adlerian epistemic lens. So first, opinions. Here we see Adler's strong personal leaning against separating faith and reason. It shapes his argument. And his clear preference for Western Aristotelian logic, he presents that as the universal standard. That's really his foundational opinion on how to judge truth.
Which seems to lead straight into his definition of knowledge.
It does. Knowledge, for Adler, demands that conflicting religious truth claims cannot both be true. It all comes back to that correspondence theory we talked about. Does it match reality? If yes, it's potential knowledge. If it contradicts known facts, it's false. He's pushing for certainty.
And trying to fit all this knowledge together gets us to understanding.
Exactly. Understanding comes through his framework, especially that distinction between poetic and logical truths. It's his way of trying to build a coherent picture, one without paradoxes. It's how he tries to achieve clarity without just throwing out everything spiritual.
And then the final goal, the big lesson, is wisdom. What's the wisdom he's imparting here?
The wisdom in this context is really his strong warning against two major intellectual dangers. First, a kind of blind relativism where, if everything's equally true, then nothing really means anything.
Or truth becomes meaningless.
And second, dogmatic materialism, which just shuts down questions about anything beyond the physical. He wants us to find a path between those two extremes.
That's quite a logical structure he's built. But, the next question has to be, where does this very rigorous, very Western framework run into problems? Culturally, ethically? Because seeking logical unity sounds appealing, but applying one framework universally, that can create friction, right?
Absolutely. And that's where looking at it through the lens of the Golden Rule becomes really revealing. Adler is aiming for universal fairness, a single standard of truth for everyone, reciprocity.
Seems fair on the surface.
But the critique points out an ethical asymmetry. His approach risks imposing a specifically Western model of rational critique, one deeply rooted in Greek philosophy, onto non-Western traditions.
Traditions that might have totally different ways of understanding truth or dealing with paradox.
Precisely. It could end up marginalizing traditions with different ways of knowing systems that might value experience or paradox or intuition more than strict non-contradiction.
We can maybe sharpen that by looking at the book's civic implications, using the U.S. Preamble as a standard. How does it fare against forming a more perfect union?
Well, Adler's insistence on unity and truth claims could actually be polarizing. In a society that values pluralism, limiting where pluralism is allowed might exclude minority views that don't start from his rationalist position. That could make achieving a perfect union harder, at least intellectually.
What about establishing justice?
Justice demands fair standards, and Adler definitely advocates for that. But critics ask, is it truly just if the standard of fairness itself comes from only one cultural logic? It might risk being unfair to those operating with different, maybe equally valid systems of thought.
And tranquility. That seems like an immediate point of tension. Pushing for intellectual rigor is one thing, but telling a whole group their core beliefs are logically false. That doesn't sound very tranquil.
No, it could easily create intellectual conflict, friction between traditions whose foundational claims get labeled inconsistent. Adler seeks clarity, sure, but that clarity might undermine social harmony, that domestic tranquility.
And you see similar tensions with providing for the common defense and promoting the general welfare.
For defense, yes, open debate and intellectual strength matter, which Adler supports. But his approach could be seen as culturally assertive, defending one logical system as the universal one. For welfare, Adler clearly wants to improve understanding, which helps the common good. But the critique suggests this intellectual gain might come at the cost of relational tolerance, that mutual respect you need for real interfaith dialogue.
And finally, securing the blessings of liberty.
Adler is definitely a defender of freely pursuing truth, but he puts clear limits on just accepting everything as equally valid on relativistic tolerance. For him, liberty is the freedom to seek the actual truth, not the freedom to pretend every answer is equally right.
This kind of deep analysis really does make you stop and think. It inspires reflection, rational thought. We should pause here briefly to mention you can check out our Mindful Moments YouTube channel. It offers AI book analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts like this one. We really recommend it. Great stuff for nourishing your mind.
Definitely worth checking out.
Okay.
So moving to our final logical analysis, we have to give Adler his due for the philosophical strengths of the book before we look at the potential shortcomings.
What really stands out as the biggest strength of truth in religion?
Oh, without a doubt, it's his incredibly rigorous defense of the unity of truth. He does a huge service, philosophically speaking, by arguing so clearly for coherence, for non-contradiction, across all areas of human thought, and that distinction he makes between poetic and factual truth. That's a really useful tool for any serious interfaith conversation. It lets you respect myth and story without confusing it with literal fact.
But the critique does pinpoint areas where, well, maybe his rigor leads to weaknesses or things that look like logical missteps in application.
Yes. The main criticism is probably that subtle inflation of Western logic into the universal standard for all rational thinking. By leaning so heavily on Aristotle's law of non-contradiction, he risks downplaying other legitimate logical systems.
Like ones that embrace paradox, maybe? Things you find more in Eastern philosophies?
Exactly. Systems built around complementary opposites or paradox. He essentially implies, if your truth doesn't fit neatly into my logical box, it isn't really truth, even if that box isn't the only one people use to understand reality. And related to that, some critics feel his critique of mythologization. Thinkers like Joseph Campbell, who look at the universal power of stories, can be a bit one-sided. He doesn't always seem to fully value the kind of truth conveyed through symbols and narratives that don't directly correspond to literal facts.
So pulling all this together, the strong logic, the ethical issues, the potential logical blind spots, what's the balanced takeaway on truth and religion?
Adler offers a really valuable defense of intellectual honesty and consistency. He forces everyone, believers, non-believers alike, to sharpen their arguments and face contradictions. That's crucial. But his work does carry the risk of marginalizing religious traditions that don't operate primarily within his specific mode of Western rationalism. He champions clarity, but maybe underestimates the value of different kinds of logic, and perhaps the benefits of a more patient, culturally humble, interreligious dialogue.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with some really deep, unresolved questions to grapple with after encountering this book.
The big one is, can truth and religion ever really be settled by logic alone? Or does faith, by its nature, involve something that transcends pure reason?
And flowing from that, how do we weigh things like paradox, mystery, against the strict demand for logical unity? Where do they fit?
Those are the huge intellectual and maybe spiritual challenges Adler leaves us wrestling with.
Just a note. The analysis framework used in this critique relies on a systematic and precise methodology designed for philosophical and ethical assessment.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis.
Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.